are dying.
Rhetoric and purpose. Prime source and
Because I don't have a future.
Hello and welcome to this special edition of the Climate Week. This is a show that's been made necessary by the gremlins that affected us on last Thursday's show. Just Stop Climate Debate, I think they're probably calling themselves. With me in the studio is Climate Debate co-founder Ed Rennie, who'll be joining us in just a minute. And I'm very pleased to be here with Catherine McBride. Economist Catherine McBride, and we're going to be talking about the economics of net zero in a much broader sense than normal, just the more than the straightforward costs. Thanks for coming. Thanks for joining us, Catherine. How's it all going?
Oh, good. It's some interesting stuff happening in climate, especially in finance.
Right. Well, we're gonna find out all about that. What I'd want to do first is just to sort of set the scene, as it were, and if we can cast our minds back to COP26, when the great and the good of the British climate financial institutions and establishment, I guess you could say, took to the stage and announced, amongst other things, the alignment of financial institutions with assets under management of up to 130 trillion US dollars with the net zero agenda. But as we're going to find out, maybe that alignment is all looking a bit shaky. Anyhow, here is the man of that moment, Mark Carney, former governor of the Bank of England, and he's explaining how he sees things. And I've put this clip into a conversation with George Monbiot, climate activist George Monbiot.
Basically, the financial system held a mirror to the climate crisis.
What protest does is to hold a mirror up to society.
These seemingly arcane but essential changes to the plumbing of finance can move and are moving climate change from the fringes to the forefront and transforming the financial system.
We need systemic change.
Banks, insurers, pension funds, asset managers, export credit agencies, stock exchanges, credit rating agencies, index providers, auditors.
That is an essential step towards change.
So make no mistake, the money is here.
System change, not climate change.
Thank you very much.
So I think we had there two versions of the climate politics. On the one hand, probably Mark Carney being very honest about what systemic change looked like, the alignment of all this money, and then there's George Monbiot's wishful thinking that the climate movement is producing this great big change in society, but actually it's just bankers, right? Is that the extent of it?
Well, it's interesting because obviously Carney has tried to get this going, and we've seen it in the insurance companies who did form an alliance, and then in May, we saw some of the original 8 insurance companies, and they're very big global insurance companies, though some of them are based in Europe, Swiss Re and Munich Re. They actually dropped out of this alignment to sort of enforce net zero. And then last week, to try and hold the group together, the UN actually dropped its rules. Now, one of the reasons given for the original big insurance companies to drop out was that the US Republican congressmen were going to, congressmen and women, I should say, were apparently going to take an antitrust issue against the insurance companies, because not just in America, in a lot of Western democracies, companies are not allowed to coordinate and work together, and especially in things like insurance. Because what people probably don't understand, many of us have insurance and we pay a premium, and if our house burns down or if we have a car accident, we claim back on it. But from the other point of view, from an insurance company's point of view, all of those premiums are added into an enormous fund. And so insurance companies are some of the biggest investors in the world, and they're investing those funds wisely, hopefully, so that when they pay out, they have the money to pay out, so that the amount of money you're paying potentially, in case your house burns down, is a fraction of how much it will actually cost the insurance company to rebuild your house. But they assume that not everyone's house will burn down at the same time. So they're taking money from everyone and they'll fix the one person that goes wrong, sort of thing. So a lot of these insurance companies, or what the initiative set up by Carney was to force companies to only invest this pension money, this collective funds, into companies that are obeying the ESG rules. And the ESG rules are very subjective. And also, though a lot of people think of them just as environment, it's also social is the S and governance is the G. So that you get some companies that are not actually doing anything very good for the environment, but they are doing a lot of social things or governance things that are deemed acceptable by the people who give you an ESG rating.
Yeah, I saw, Elon Musk was complaining a while back that Tesla has a lower ESG score than Lockheed Martin, which makes, amongst other things, I think, nuclear bombs. Well, certainly big weapons. That seems quite surprising.
I believe that he's got a lower ESG score than some of the oil companies, which is even more surprising. So yes, it's very, very subjective. And so even though some large companies have dropped out of this coordinated system because they don't want to get attacked by an antitrust lawsuit, because that would really wreck their business, and many of them have huge amounts of business in the US, many of them, unfortunately, have published their own individual climate initiatives. And that's slightly disappointing to me, because when I heard they were dropping out, I really hoped that they had done their own numbers and realized that this thing is bunkum. Because the one thing insurance companies are good at is working out risk. You know, yes, they have the people at the front who are selling insurance or whatever, but in the back room of every insurance company in the world, there is the most phenomenal amount of risk analysis going on, and they know the risk of everything. You know, and especially in London, where we do a lot of unusual risk, it's sort of pretty well organized to do life insurance, because life expectancy tables, they started drawing them up 200 years ago, and they've got better and better at it. And if you tell them enough about yourself and, you know, how old you are, whether you smoke, what you eat, how much exercise you do, they'll know pretty much how long you're going to live. But in the UK, we do a lot of, we insure oil rigs, we insure hurricane risk for the US coastline. We insure even they do insurance on contracts, so you can get insurance that a contract won't be fulfilled and things like that. I mean, they insure planes, flight risk and things like that. So there's a lot of things going on that we insure, and we have people calculating those risks all the time. And you might have seen this week yet another Nobel Prize winner came out saying the numbers supporting net zero don't add up. And
Well,
more smart people are saying that. And if anyone worked that out first, it should be the insurance companies. They should have been the first ones to go, hang on a minute. If we really believe in net zero, why are we still insuring the East Coast of America? If we really think that seas are rising this quickly, shouldn't we maybe stop insuring these people? Now, instead, in this sort of proposal, if you look at AXA, who've just published their proposal of how they individually will look after net zero, they have not only are they going to reduce investing in companies that they consider to not be viable ESG companies, they're also probably going to stop insuring companies that they are producing oil or using plastics or whatever.
So this is essentially debanking of clients that they don't want. Is that, or something equivalent to debanking? What do you think that's because? I take your point. So there's not going to be the climate crisis as has been conceived by just stop oil fanatics and so on. So there's obviously a different metric going on in the back rooms of the insurance companies. But do you think they may be making a political decision that their interests are better served within sort of some form of net zero framework than outside of it? Maybe there's sort of more politics going on here than science, and the politics is more important. What's the quid pro quo of ignoring the numbers as such? Back. And if I just carry on distracting you for a moment, back in the 2000s, when we started seeing these sort of stories and we're trying to pick them up and try to understand what was going on, I think the way, because I think there was a controversy. Roger Pielke Jr. had done some work for an insurer. I think it was possibly Swiss Re, but I don't remember. And he was pointing out that the work he'd done for them, they had just sort of pretty much ignored. And he was pointing out hurricanes are not increasing. Losses from hurricanes and other violent weather are not increasing when you normalize for GDP, and so on and so forth, and similar effects. So we said fear of risk is to an insurance company as oil is to Exxon, for example. So we thought perhaps that the insurance companies had an interest in people being more scared of climate change than they need to be, and other things than they need to be. But that's probably a bit simple, isn't it? And so there's about 3 or 4 questions in there at once. So, but pick and choose.
It's not simple at all, actually. It's probably absolutely on the money. Because if you can convince people that there's a real risk that their house will burn down or their house will be flooded, then you'll also be able to convince them to pay more for their insurance policy. So you'll be able to say, where last year your policy was X, because there's now a much greater risk that you're going to be flooded with rising sea levels or hurricanes hitting you. Therefore, we're going to charge you twice as much. And even though the actual risk hasn't changed at all. So probably the last thing an insurance company wanted was Roger Pielke Jr. out there explaining to people that the risk of getting hit by a hurricane has gone down. Because if they think that the risk of getting hit by a hurricane has gone down, then maybe people will decide not to insure at all. They'll start going, oh, well, maybe I don't need this insurance. So I think there is certainly a vested interest for an insurance company wanting you to believe the risk is higher than it actually is. Because that enables them to charge more, and it stops people deciding that maybe they don't need the insurance. So that there is certainly that element of it must be there for sure. But there is, sorry, what was the first question? You started on a good note as well.
I was trying to get to what's the quid pro quo? Is there a sort of more of a political interest in insurance companies essentially debanking or something equivalent to debanking oil companies or even just disobedient companies that don't do their ESG submissions in the way that.
Well, yes, but also doing these sort of submissions and even worrying about them is a cost. And unfortunately, what the little Carney Club, if you like, involves all of the world's large multinationals. And what they are doing is colluding to exclude new entrants into the market. So it'll be much harder for a small business to start up and compete because they won't be able to tick all the ESG boxes. You won't be able to do, if you're a one-man band starting up your own company, you probably can't tick the diversity box because you're only you, and whatever color you are is the only color you're going to be. So there's a lot of things that about this whole ESG thing that excludes new people entering the market. And that, I think, is why the US government and politicians are looking at this as an antitrust thing. Because for capitalism to thrive, we need to allow new companies to come in. We need new market entrants all the time. We need competition in markets. And if you've got large companies that can do some extraordinary amount of weird box ticking that allows an oil company to have a higher ESG score than a company that makes electric vehicles, then you've really sort of flipped the whole dynamic, if you like. You're making people that intuitively we know possibly aren't doing the right thing to look like they're doing the right thing. And sometimes they are. I mean, I know at least one fund management company that to get a good ESG score, they did something that I think is incredibly sensible. They started donating money to companies that are taking landmines out of previous war zones. So you often find when there's been a war somewhere, landmines have been laid, and yet no one bothers to ever take them out again because it's very dangerous business. Now, that's a fantastic thing. I think that's either social or governance, but you still can get a high ESG score for doing that without having to bother with the environment stuff. I mean, the other interesting thing about the way at least AXA's insurance ideas are written down is that it will also encourage them to be insuring companies that are basically service industries where there is a very low environmental footprint anyhow. They use a lot of electricity. If you're running a big bank and you've got a dealing room going, obviously you can't afford there to ever be a blackout. But at the same time, it's not like getting minerals out of the ground or making steel or doing things that we actually need for the infrastructure. Because like every one of those big banks in the City of London is in a building that was made using cement and steel. And they've got a computer in front of them that was made using plastics. And there's a lot of things that they don't count. That's not their problem, if you like. That's the building.
Well, that's what I was. I was going to ask you: Can companies of any kind, well, especially ones with, especially ones with maybe more of an industrial footprint, but can companies of any kind go net zero without destroying themselves, without destroying their customers, and maybe their supply chain, value chain, and can financial markets and exotic financial products, can capital markets save the planet? I think it was KPMG or some other big firm said that financial markets can save the planet. But they're kind of quite virtual, aren't they? They kind of exist on a layer of capitalism that's very abstract and removed from everyone else, although may be dependent on it, or all other forms of industries. But can they so it might be easy for them to sort of say we're net zero, because like you say, it's mainly paper. Well, it would have been fax machines, and then it was internet and the data centers and so on. But if the whole value chain went net zero, how much of it would survive? Could it topple over completely? And would that be? I presume it's sort of. I'll let you make sense of that. Sorry, that's a question.
It's how they count it. It's really interesting as to what we count as our emissions and what we count as your emissions, sort of thing. And certainly, though, as a company themselves, the financial markets don't have a big carbon footprint, but a lot of them have massive cloud storage reserves, and some of the cloud bases are apparently using a lot of electricity, a lot of energy. But where they're meant to save the planet is by investing in new technology that will be more efficient than the old technology. Now, a lot of them, unfortunately, might know a lot about maths, but haven't looked into the science behind this. And so they do tend to back the wrong horse, if you like, because there's a herd mentality. And the same thing we've seen with our governments, where they have all rushed into one sort of technology. This is obvious in the UK, where they want everyone to get a heat pump. And there are other ways of heating a house which are being neglected and are not getting investments into them. So that, as long as we don't let governments or banks pick winners, and they're both as bad as each other, you need those new ideas to come forward, and you need, because also we've gone the same way with the electric vehicles, and yet Porsche in Germany has spent a lot of money creating a new sort of fuel, a thing called an e-fuel, which they think is a more efficient fuel and would obviously have a lower total carbon footprint than getting an electric vehicle. The problem with the electric vehicle footprint is we only count the charging. The fact that it was made somewhere else and it had to get minerals from somewhere else and they had to be refined somewhere else, that's not our problem. That's not in our footprint. So you see that a lot with the way countries like to claim that they've lowered their carbon emission footprint. But what most of them have done, and the UK is particularly bad at this, I mean, we've done three things. We have swapped coal-fired power stations for gas-fired power stations, and that's great, because that's about halves your emissions there, but just your electricity production emissions. But and then we also got our landfill under control, because landfill produces a lot of methane. I know people like to blame it on cows, but rotting vegetables is just as bad. And in some of those cases, we're actually piping the methane off the landfill and using it, which is even better. But the really big thing we did was we deindustrialized, and we allowed all of that industry to move to China or Japan or South Korea or somewhere else. So our footprint is low by the way we count it, because we count emissions by production rather than by consumption. And if you actually looked at what we consume on a daily basis, our emissions haven't changed at all. It's just that they're not our emissions, they're China's emissions. The only thing we've really done that I think has lowered individuals' emissions is moving to LED lights. And that's a really interesting case, because 20 years ago, there was a building regulation that did require people to put 25% of low emission lights into your house, into a new build house or a refurbishment. But a lot of those were sort of compact fluorescents at the time, and LEDs were around, but they're pretty ugly lighting. They've now produced a much better color range in the light, so that it's much better lighting. And the compact fluorescents have disappeared, and everyone's bought LEDs. And there wasn't a government edict saying you must buy an LED.
Right.
And you know, if a technology is ready to happen, it happens. You know,
That's right. Yeah, right. So the LEDs, in fact, were made fantastically cheaper by
Yeah.
industrial and economic dynamism in the East, not by political interventions, policy interventions in the West. That created a market for them. I mean,
Yes.
I don't think people would have stayed with incandescent bulbs for the. I mean, I think I remember it was a couple of years between compact fluorescents and then then you'd go to someone's house and it would just be LEDs. So yeah, very interesting that we've always our policies have been about creating markets essentially for more productive, more dynamic producers where industry is growing. And I think what's the term? Is it leakage? That's what the wonks like to call this offshoring of our CO2 emissions and our dependence on other countries.
Except the term leakage sounds like it's a very small amount disappearing. You know, this wasn't a leakage. This was like a pipeline of pouring our industry and our dirtiest industry, because even though we still have sort of steel here, a lot of the if you like, primary steel making is happening elsewhere. A lot of the steel making we're doing here is recycling steel, which is a good thing. I'm really happy that we are doing that. So the steel comes here. Sometimes it's in a rough state and we are refining it into a much more usable state. But also we have a lot of remaking of metals, because they're fantastic substances. They are, you know, they can be used again and again and again. I was staggered a few years ago. I was doing some looking at the sort of exports we'd expect, not even years ago, months ago, on the CPTPP. And the sort of one thing that I knew in the back of my brain from primary school or whatever, secondary, maybe not so long ago, was that Chile is the biggest exporter of copper in the world. And I just thought I'd check that before I wrote it into a paper. And I was intrigued to discover one of the second biggest is Germany. And I was thinking, Germany doesn't have copper, but of course what they have is recycled copper. Right. And, you know, the UK, we're sending a lot of these metals to India at the moment. We're exporting metals, but they're not primary metals we're taking out of the ground. They're recycled, a scrap metal that we're sending to India for recycling. So that this is, that's a really good thing to do. I'm absolutely 100% pushing that.
Well, it's economic, right? No one's against economic recycling. And no one ever has been. But I remember it was when we had to recycle plastics. It was only because there was a market for them in China, and I believe they were making fleeces out of like our old pop bottles.
Yeah, they do.
You know, but whereas we just didn't have that capacity here. Anyway, Ed is here, and I think he may want to say something.
Okay.
Yeah, Catherine. I mean, I was just interested to bring it back to Mark Carney and COP26, because it seems to me there's sort of three distinct time periods when I suppose across the whole of the European Union, and when we were part of it, from about the early 90s, there was the pursuit of essentially the green agenda. And then it seems to me that there's political decisions that have come about since climate change legislation. I mean, I think of in this country in particular. But then there's also the Mark Carney kind of ESG environmental finance stuff. Is it possible to kind of distinguish between what is kind of government political decisions to just, for example, you know, Ed Davey making sure that to even investigate whether there's shale gas in UK sites, he's made it so that any tremor where a truck goes past your house, that's the level, and therefore making it impossible to even investigate. Such as and not opening new oil fields. And to what extent can we kind of put it on the kind of the financial stuff that Mark Carney initiated, or even maybe it was going on beforehand and he was just kind of raising it up the agenda?
This will sound very cynical, but I do believe a lot of those bankers, especially bankers in government, as opposed to people at the coalface, if you like, finding or looking for new investments. A lot of the sort of governance people, when they don't jump on the bandwagon until it's well and truly going, because they never want to be wrong. They don't want to be on the wrong side of things. So they will wait and see. So I'm pretty sure Carney basically is jumping on late. There will be people out there who are financing new technology that we don't even know about yet, and they're the guys that are there early. But in terms of, sorry, you said something at the beginning of that which I wanted to pick up on, and it's now I've forgotten what it was. But
was that Europe in the early 90s started to kind of ardently pursue this environmental agenda. I mean, it's accelerated since then, but it seems to me kind of 1992 might have been the time it really kind of began in earnest, at least the European level.
Well, it sort of became, it all started with sort of recycling, which is a good thing. I was a big environmentalist when it meant sort of picking up garbage. What amazes me is, as we talk a bigger and bigger game about the environment, our life has become more and more throwaway. I'm old enough to remember, glass milk bottles being put on your doorstep each day by a milk cart, which were often electric motors. They were way ahead of their time. And the next day you put the empty milk bottles out and they were taken away by the milkman and you get new milk bottles. And when you went to the greengrocer, there wasn't sort of supermarkets as much. You bought what you wanted and they put it into a brown paper bag. A lot of things that
aren't these economic? I mean, isn't it just more economic to?
Well, that's right. Our whole life has become where everything, like, not only are we now talking over an electric connection, where 30 years ago we would have had to meet in person. So, no electricity would have been involved, possibly oil and gas of us getting to the same location. But it's much quicker for a supermarket if everything's already in a bag with a tag on it. And so
the energy needed to reprocess even a milk bottle might be a greater footprint, might be a greater impact than the energy required to produce a new capsule to put milk in that is disposable, but at the other end of it, you can put it in the furnace and recover the energy.
Well,
is that not fair?
That would be true, yeah, definitely. And that's how they sold it to us, that we should get rid of milk bottles and go for cartons and then plastic bottles, etc. But I think a lot of that calculation relied on someone recycling them, as in either burning the carton and taking the energy, not just burning it, or melting the milk bottle down and making another milk bottle.
Well, I think even washing them requires hot water. That's the.
Oh, well, that's what they said. They were saying that washing the milk bottles out required hot water and detergent, and that was polluting, etc. So this sort of we started gradually, and we've moved slowly along. I mean, some things that were done in Europe in the 90s were extremely important if you look at house building, but they were also picked up by countries where it really matters. So somewhere like Finland, where it's really cold in the winter, they had the most amazingly insulated houses. And Germany was the same, where they invented ways of insulating windows and things that we just didn't take up in the UK because we don't have that level of cold winters.
We don't have the same climate. We have a very damp climate as well, yeah.
Yes, but we benefit from the Gulf Stream coming across, which Central Europe doesn't have that. So that Central Europe adopted all of these processes of insulating your house long before we did. So it's always necessity is the mother of invention, as they used to say. And now they're trying to convince us that we all need these things. And in some cases that doesn't work. Most obviously in the UK, where new houses or not even existing houses, have tried to install these sort of highly sealed windows and discovered that it's creating mold. So there's a lot of there's a lot of things that technology can't always be moved from one location to the other. And a lot of countries in, say, Arabia, where they've lived with 50-degree summers for a long, long time, their traditional buildings with very thick walls and very small windows were designed to survive that sort of heat. In the Australian outback, 200 years ago, when people first were moving there, they designed houses with large verandas all the way around the house and breezeways through the middle, and high pitch roofs where the heat would go. Much more effective in surviving in that sort of climate than the present houses, cookie cutter houses that are being built in suburbs west of Sydney, that have just come, someone who's never lived in the west of Sydney thought, oh, that looks right. And they just built them and they just keep churning them out. So you see a lot of modern things we're building are suiting the economics rather than the climate. And then we're suddenly introducing these enormous changes to cope with the climate. And you think, well, maybe we should have started with the small traditional things that we've always done, because maybe we worked all this stuff out hundreds of years ago, and we've forgotten about why we built houses the way we built them, and why we did the things we did. But anyhow, that's another philosophical thing.
So, Ed, I've muted you just because we were getting feedback through your speakers and the microphone, but you can unmute yourself when you want to speak. So, Catherine, were you saying there essentially kind of were you sort of getting towards the idea that net zero creates this cookie cutter approach where everything becomes a bit more uniform towards the political goal, but actually it sort of becomes divorced from all of this generations of learned experience that people have, how to farm, how to build houses, how to relate to each other given the circumstances that they live in, maybe their geography, or some other parameters, and that this is a very sort of top-down thing, which is going to be quite harmful. I mean, if people are stuck in homes that don't ventilate properly, either for damp or to keep the temperature down, that's a really unpleasant consequence, isn't it? And it sort of speaks to the slightly domineering attitude that Greens have.
Well, it goes back to this strange dichotomy where the kids outside Parliament protesting about the green agenda, the next day you will see a sea of litter of plastic bottles and sandwich wrappers and the extraordinary amount of garbage, because they don't see that as a problem. They've grown up in a life where they're worried about the world in 100 years and the big picture, and they've lost the small picture. 30 years ago, my generation was more we were looking at the small picture. So you've now got a situation where not only do we all rely on electricity to run our houses and now our cars and the fact that we are having a meeting online, but they're also talking about having electricity run our money. And you sit there going, we're making a life that is more and more dependent on electricity at a time when we're sort of producing less and less reliable electricity in the name of net zero. And you're sort of going, something about this doesn't add up. And we also have that in the green movement, if you like, because some Greens want us to go back to the 16th century. They believe that they're the very anti-growth, anti-progress. And there's another group that want us to move to hydrogen, and they are, trying to create new ways of making electricity and going sort of, completely. And it is sort of pick a side. At the moment, you've got these two groups that are interfering with each other. They're almost cancelling each other out. And it's sort of, I'm more for the second. I think if there
that's what I was going to.
if there's a problem, if there's really a problem, we have the technology to adapt to it and to fix it, because we always have.
Yeah,
I grew up in a country where every summer is at least 10 degrees hotter than the summer here.
Right.
And yet no one, when I was a child there, ever thought that was unusual. Yeah. Right now, you might have seen the fabulous map that was shown around last week with a red center on the Earth and then sort of different colors as it got colder. And as they were telling us this was the hottest day on Earth ever, I couldn't help but notice the color they had colored in the UK, green, was exactly the same color they'd colored in Australia and South Africa and Argentina. So the color that is winter in Australia, South Africa and Argentina is summer in the UK. And yet it's the UK that is panicking about climate change. And I look at that graph and think, guys, if anyone should be happy about climate change, it should be the UK. But
I often think that, especially about Scotland. Scotland is the most concerned about climate change. I suppose that a lot of people in Scotland have very, very fair skin that may be vulnerable to sunshine. But it's hilarious to hear them worry about sea level rise up a mountain or slightly warmer temperatures. I mean, I've been in Scotland and in the summer, and it might as well be winter here. It's fantastic.
Well,
I wanted to ask you, I mean, just to bring it back to money again, or finance, because you mentioned some things there. Has there been anything positive about the divestment movement in your view? Because I'm conscious we've been talking for nearly 45 minutes.
Around the houses, yeah.
So has there been any positive measurable effect of all of this divestment of the kind that either Mark Carney is leading, or the kind of sort of the Borg-like kind of activist on the street and shutting things down is demanding?
Actually,
have they produced anything of any good, or is it all just awful?
No, I think it's incredibly dangerous from a geopolitical standpoint. They are looking at it from their little Davos club of 500 wealthy companies and the people who work for them, and they have no problems. And geopolitically, it's incredibly dangerous what they're doing, because we are now more and more reliant on other countries to provide our fuel and our goods. So the UK is reliant on China, and not just for our everyday goods and parts that are going into things that we make here, but we're using parts, or even, say, pharmaceuticals, they're using the ingredients are coming from China. But you've also got even our renewable industry relies on China. Our wind turbines and our solar panels are coming from China. And meanwhile, most of Europe was relying on Russia for gas. And you can see how that worked out. You by making ourselves more and more reliant on goods that we don't make. And half the reason we don't make them is because we're trying to get a good mark in our carbon footprint calculation. That means that we've got to really remain friendly with all of those countries. And when you've got 2/3 of the world not listening to Mark Carney, and we're the only guys that are following his silly rules, then we're in trouble, not them. There's a lot of this that I was thinking about this when Rishi Sunak recently reintroduced the £170 what's the word? I'll call it a tax.
As levy maybe.
Levy. I think levy. Yes, that's a polite word for tax. On energy bills to cope with climate change or to help fight climate change or something. This had been cancelled by Liz Truss, and it's now come back again. And for most of Mark Carney's mates, all of the people that are in his club, they will spend more than £170 on a pair of shoes or maybe a tie. You know, that is just such minimal spending for them. They wouldn't have batted an eyelid asking people to pay that. That's chump change. They've got that down the couch. Then for even our politicians who have imposed this on the UK, that is also chump change. Most of them are, well, they're on a lot more. Their salary, they will not notice that. And yet when you get down the chain, and it is hugely regressive because it's the same price for everyone, basically. So when you get back to people on average wages or minimum wages, that's a lot of money. And
Ed's got a question on that point.
Yeah.
Yeah, I just I suppose it's two questions really. One is, I mean, it sounds like this is being a hidden, but actually quite a high contributor to our inflationary problems. And do you think that's correct? And secondly, I suppose, once dealing with the inflation thing, what if you could say to the manifesto writers of the two main parties to get themselves off this ridiculous process where we think we can become dependent on wind and solar when we can't, what would be, in terms of energy in particular, what would be your political suggestions to whichever party is going to be in government after the next general election? How fast can we dump a lot of this stuff, I suppose?
Well, could you just say your first question again?
So the first one is about inflation. This sounds like it's all contributed a lot behind the scenes to the high inflation that we have.
It's not just the one, sort of the £170, though that's an addition. All government taxes that are consumer-based taxes are adding to inflation, so that if a product goes up, the underlying product goes up by 10%, that's increased by the VAT that's added on it, but it's also the shop that's selling it. It's increased on their electricity bills or on their green charges. The trucks that delivered it, they also have fuel duty added on, which is yet another tax. If you go down the line, a huge amount of any increase is inflated itself by the many, many levels of government taxation that's added to it. And then they put up interest rates to try and fight that. And you sit there going, why don't you just cut the tax? You know, we could have lowered our VAT pretty much across the board when we left the EU, because a proportion of all VAT was paid to the EU. It's how the EU calculates what an economy owes to the people in Brussels. So we could have just cut our VAT by the amount we used to give to the EU, and that would help everyone across the board in the country, lower prices, help people get over the cost of living crisis. And it wouldn't have made any difference to our treasury, because we used to give the money to the EU anyhow.
I think that was a pledge, wasn't it? I think people were saying that we could remove the VAT on domestic energy, which isn't at the full rate, which isn't at the 20%, but that was like one of we can cut. I think it's 5%.
It's 5%. We could have cut that, and we haven't done that. But it's we could have probably cut 5% off all. Some would go to 0 and some would go from 20 to 15, right. But they didn't do it. And that's kind of incredible to me, that this sort of card trick, if you like, where people didn't notice that money that we used to pay to the EU was never given back to the population. your second one is how can government manifestos change? It's tricky because a lot of I think they will change when they realize this doesn't matter to people. When I first heard about insurance companies dropping out of the UN net zero group, I really thought that they've obviously looked at this and decided that it's not benefiting them in any way. That, people don't choose their insurance company by whether it's part of the net zero association or not. They look at the premium and they go with the company that's offering them the most payouts for the least premium. And I think that over time, more and more companies are going to sit there and go, yeah, we're paying up to this stuff, but our customers are only interested in the product we're producing. They don't really care about this other things. Now, there will always be an element of customer who does care, such as the people who still buy organic meat rather than but they're a rarefied bunch in a supermarket because the very non-organic meat is still available. So no one's kind of stopped eating that. So, this idea that we're all going to move into the high-end stuff is just not what's happening on the ground. And political parties, unfortunately, especially in the UK, are very good at taking statistics and looking at what their voters want. And unfortunately, our political parties don't have any vision or any ideas of their own. They tend to go to focus groups and find out what most voters want. And as more and more focus groups are showing what's important to the populace is economic factors or immigration factors. And if you look at the last few focus groups that were published on the internet, the environment was right down the bottom. Basically, people aren't voting on environment, and it's going to start.
The only thing they can say anyone voted for in the last 10 or 15 years is Brexit.
Well,
maybe
yes.
even longer, maybe 25 years. That's the thing that's preoccupied politicians. But
it hasn't.
Sorry, the European Union is the thing that has preoccupied that, whereas the public has only really signalled its dissatisfaction with that preoccupation.
But weirdly, if you look at, say, the Conservative Party manifesto in 2019, they did mention something about the green agenda, but it was like
they all did.
But it was like one paragraph on page 57 or something. It was right at the back. And all the stuff on the front page and in big bold letters and take back control and, build whatever they were saying, whatever their slogan was at the time. That was, get Brexit done. That's what it was. That's all up front. And so people think they're voting for that. But if you look at what was achieved by the present government, they've changed hands. One of the few things they seem to have done is this one paragraph on page 57. They don't seem to have got any of the first 50 pages. They were all put in the bin somehow along the line.
Yeah.
And I think that as the population see the cost of that one paragraph on page 57 in their daily lives, and they are beginning to see that, they're all going to start questioning whether they're voting for the right politicians.
What if there's an alternative? Yes, yeah, but we have to wait for that.
Yeah, well, as you see, for a long time, people were happy with immigration because it was at a low level. The people coming in, like me, I'm an immigrant. They ticked the boxes and they were the right sort of, they had a job. Their job was paying them enough money, so they didn't need to fall back on social services or anything like that. And then those visas, those work visas, were limited to 5 years. You had to apply to stay longer, so that a lot of people who came then left again. And no one seemed to have a problem with that. But when you suddenly got unlimited immigration, it started kicking back. So the political parties that were pro that found that they were losing voters. And I think that's one of the reasons why the Labor Party lost so many of its seats that it had never lost before in the last election, because they were the people whose jobs were being undercut by the mass immigration. And it was quite all right for the people sitting in the City of London to not mind the handful of German bankers who arrived, because at least they could speak other languages. They had something to offer. But we weren't working in factories in the north of England where the language of the workers in the factory was becoming Romanian, and
Right.
no one even spoke English anymore.
Yeah, there's been some big changes over the last 20 years in that area. Yeah. Well, listen, we're coming up to an hour. We've been chatting.
Oh, really?
For, which
we
is
talked that long?
much
Wow.
longer than we asked you for. But it's been fascinating, and it's such a complex, underexplored area. And I think, unfortunately, the conversation in public gets dominated by science. These superficial discussions: is it happening or is it not happening? And very little else. And the economics of it really get ignored. Whereas that economics used to be the core of the political discussion, where in maybe putting it too strongly, maybe, but like when it used to be a debate between, broadly speaking, capitalism and socialism, and the public were asked to make a choice between parties making those kind of choices. There doesn't seem to be any discussion that's fun about economics that's fundamental to people's different interests. It's all from without. It's all this kind of almost force majeure that sort of dominates the political landscape. But we've got to get you back. Go on. Okay, go on.
I think the dividing line should be: do we want to face global change, climate change, and climate has always changed, by going back to the 16th century when people really died of cold and hunger? Or do we want to face changing climate by adapting to it? And I'm voting for the adaptation. Okay, I just put
Adaptation
that in there.
Party.
That's
We're with you. We're with you. We'll be on the same. We'll share a platform with you on that one. But
and that is the big division that they have to work out. I mean, there are other things we could discuss, and maybe
we're going to
another
have to
time
get
we
you
will.
back. We're going to have to get you back to talk about the Adaptation Party's manifesto, because there's so much to talk about, because it hasn't been talked about for decades, and that's what climatedebate.co.uk is really set up to do. So
can I add one other thing that we should talk about before, is that we, as a country, we rely on, well, we don't rely on exports, but we do export a lot, and it does help our economy. And one of the things we export is cars. And by trying to force car makers to produce only electric cars by 2030, we could be really shooting ourselves in the foot. Because both feet, because a lot of even the EU, where we still sell a lot of cars by volume, not as much by value, they are going to wait till 2035 before they convert completely. But to the countries where we sell the big value cars, which is outside the EU, so 60% of the value of our exports of cars are going outside the EU. And those are often to countries that have plentiful oil, but not such reliable electricity. Some of them have very big distances where people are less interested or less able to even think about getting an electric car. And yet that's what we're going to force our manufacturers to make. So I predict that if we don't change that, those manufacturers are just going to move a factory to India or China, or
if they haven't already,
somewhere else.
Yeah.
Because,
right. So, but look, we've got to wrap it up, because we've got 30 seconds left before the hour. But hope you will come back and talk to us.
I will definitely come back.
Depth about these things. It's been absolutely fascinating, and we've got so much. Obviously, got so much to talk about. Thank you very much for watching. Please stay on the line, Catherine and Ed, and we'll have to continue the conversation. Thanks very much for watching. If you'd like to support these kind of more of these live streams and more of the work we're doing at Climate Debate, please do go to our website and go to the donate page, or just have a look and about the stuff we've produced, and please share our work. I'll put under the description of this video, Catherine, I'll put some ways that people can follow you, where they can find you on social media, and so on. So all I think there is left to say is goodbye, and I'll let a bigger Ben say those words.